Top 10 lists are something that are very widespread across social media platforms when it comes to the MMA community. There's top 10 lists for just about every aspect of mixed martial arts. Top 10 fighters of a certain year, top 10 fighters of a certain weight class, top 10 submissions, top 10 knockouts, top 10 fights of a decade. You name it, there's a top 10 list out there for some aspect of the game of mixed martial arts. So I figured I might as well dip my name in the hat of top 10 lists across this MMA YouTube community. And this is going to be the top 10 UFC prospects of 2022. I just wanted to add a little disclaimer before we get into my top 10. It's not a top 10 in terms of a sort of divisional ranking where 10 is the worst of the prospects and number 1 is the best. It's just a top 10 overall because I feel like it would do a disservice to a lot of these prospects to rank them in terms of who was the best and who was the worst. So just a quick disclaimer, but let's start it off with the first entry. Up first on our list of prospects is current UFC middleweight, former EFC two-weight world champion, and former KSW middleweight champion in Dricus du Plessis. Now, recently du Plessis has had a little bit of unfortunate luck. He was originally scheduled to take on Anthony Fluffy Hernandez at UFC 273, and on that same card, Kelvin Gastelum and Nasruddin Imavov were set to do battle to determine who would move up in terms of the top 10 middleweight divisional rankings. Now, Imavov was unable to obtain a visa, canceling his fight with Gastelum. Anthony Hernandez was originally, like I said, set to take on du Plessis, but Gastelum stepped up and the fight was going to be du Plessis versus Gastelum, giving him a shot at the top 10 of the middleweight division. Unfortunately for him, Kelvin Gastelum would get injured and it would kind of push back a lot of plans for du Plessis. But now it's kind of a question of how far can Dricus get in the middleweight division. He's a very well-rounded competitor with very solid left body kicks, left high kicks, switch kicks, and a solid yet underrated, I feel, ground game. Very good wrestling, very good scrambling ability, and knockout power, which he showcased in his last fight against another prospect in this division in Trevin Giles after catching him with a brutal shot and knocking him out at UFC 264 Poirier vs. McGregor 3. A lot of unanswered questions in terms of this former champion from another organization, but a lot of questions that I feel like fans are awaiting answers to eagerly with eyes wide open. So it's going to be very interesting to see who du Plessis gets next, and I cannot wait to see the rise of Still Knox under the UFC banner. The next entry on our list comes in the form of current undefeated UFC welterweight, ranked number 15 in the division, in Shavkat Rakhmonov. Now, Rakhmonov holds an impressive record of 15 victories and no defeats. His first UFC fight came not so long ago at UFC 254 Nurmagomedov versus Gaethje. He got a very tough test in his first fight, fighting UFC veteran and tested dangerous Brazilian in the form of Alex Cowboy Oliveira, who he made quick work of with a first-round guillotine submission victory. This is something that I think a lot of fans were surprised by, because normally when you get a UFC veteran in your first fight under the organization, it has a little bit of a challenging aspect to it. But Rakhmonov walked through him basically and kind of did it with flying colors. And he's not really a, Russian fighter who's known for heavy grappling only, because he's a well-rounded fighter in terms of all aspects of mixed martial arts. And you could see that in his last fight where he got a spinning wheel kick KO over Carlston Harris. This fighter is going up against Neil Magny, who's ranked in the top 10 of the welterweight division, for his next fight. It's a tough test for Nomad, but one that I feel if he gets through and gets through impressively, the sky could be the limit for this undefeated prospect. Up next on our list is the number 11 ranked UFC lightweight with a professional record of 18 victories and 2 defeats in Arman Tsarukyan. Tsarukyan came into his last fight and dominated another prospect who could actually be on this list in Joel Alvarez. Yoel Alvarez was actually picked to defeat Arman Tsarukyan by a lot of people in the MMA community all over YouTube and the predictions and everything leading up to the fight. And what came to be was actually a pretty dominant one-sided grappling and ground and pound showcase from Tsarukyan, where he dominated him from the full guard and landed brutal ground and pound elbows, cutting open the head of Yoel Alvarez before the referee eventually jumped in and stopped the fight for a second round TKO victory. And like I said, Alvarez is probably still considered a prospect that you could put on the list that I'm presenting to you right now. But the most impressive thing from Arman Tsarukyan is probably one, that he trains alongside Petr Yan at Tiger Muay Thai and has been training alongside Petr Yan for a very long time. He also trained with Dustin Poirier leading up to his fight against Khabib Nurmagomedov at UFC 242. But in his first fight under the UFC banner, he fought one of the most dangerous lightweights in the entire sport, in Islam Makhachev. And not only did he compete against Islam Makhachev, but he also gave him one of his most competitive and difficult fights. And not only that, it was the fact that he made it difficult and it made it competitive in a grappling aspect. Tons of scrambles, tons of reversing of positions, tons of shrimping and hip control, and a lot of reversals into takedowns and takedowns into other takedown attempts. I mean, it was just one of the best fights to showcase high-level grappling in mixed martial arts. And if you haven't watched that fight, go out of your way to check it out. But Tsarukyan is ranked number 11, and I could definitely see him making it into that top 5 and potentially being a title contender in the future. So there is no ifs, ands, or buts about why Arman Tsarukyan made this list. Coming to you next on our list is current unranked UFC featherweight just outside of the top 15 in the undefeated Lerone the Miracle Murphy. Lerone is one of the biggest prospects coming out of England all over the MMA scene and definitely under the UFC banner. He's a guy who can kind of do it all. I think a lot of people may discredit his grappling, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and defense ability, but if you watch his fight against Makwan Amirkhani, even though he did get taken down and out-wrestled and out-controlled on the mat, once he got up to his feet, he landed a brutal knee as Makwan tried to shoot in for a takedown and knocked him out cold in the second round at UFC 267, Blachowicz versus Teixeira. Lerone Murphy is a guy who, like we said, can do it all. He's got great timing, great ability to use fakes and feints to set up his crisp and clean striking and counter ability. I am very excited to see where this undefeated prospect goes in terms of his MMA career and in terms of his UFC career. In 1 or 2 fights, possibly 3, he could be ranked in the top 10 at 145 pounds. Good all around, a sharp, clean, and technical fighter. The Miracle is on to big things in 2022 and so on. The next fighter on our list might surprise a lot of people, but in my opinion, he's definitely a prospect you have to watch out for in the 145-pound division, and that is Gavin the Governor Tucker. Now, I know Gavin Tucker lost his last fight via first-round KO to Dan 50K Ige. Now, Dan Ige has had a little bit of a rough patch lately in his UFC career, but he's fought the best of the best in that division. Korean Zombie, Kelvin Cater, Josh Emmett, Edson Barbosa, you name it. Dan Ige has fought almost everybody, and he's one of the toughest matchups in the division for a lot of individuals. The guy comes to fight, and if he lands on anybody's chin with the power he possesses, it could be a short night for just about anybody. But coming off of that loss, you look at some of his other performances in the UFC. Most recently, prior to this loss, his performance against Billy Quarantillo at UFC 256. He looked amazing against Quarantillo, and he really showcased his entire MMA game. His footwork, his angles, his ability to stance switch and land brutal combinations, including high kicks, kicks to the body, switching off, to get angles and landing kicks to the body on an opposite stanced opponent. Gavin Tucker has it all, and he has almost every weapon you could want in a rising star in MMA. And this was his first loss in professional MMA, and, it is what it is. Everybody at some point, unless your name is Khabib Nurmagomedov, suffers a loss in their professional career. But I see big things for Gavin Tucker, and with 1 or 2 more wins, he could be in the top 15 and top 10 at 145 pounds. And alongside divisional stablemate and teammate Arnold Allen, make a huge impact in terms of the Canadian presence in high-level mixed martial arts. The next competitor on our list comes in the form of Josh Barnett prodigy and Victor La Mangosta Henry. Now, Henry has only had one fight in the UFC, and it came against another dangerous contender in that bantamweight division in Raoni Barcelos. Barcelos has fallen off a bit after this loss and a loss to Timur Valiev via decision, but he's still considered one of the most dangerous and promising prospects in the 135-pound division, and some have even compared him to a prime Jose Aldo early on in his career. Henry and Barcelos actually set the record for the number 2 most strikes thrown in a bantamweight bout in the UFC, with 315 significant strikes exchanged between the two of them. The number 1 spot goes to Petr Yan and Corey Sandhagen for their bout at UFC 267, which I believe is one of the best bantamweight fights, or the best bantamweight fight in the history of the UFC. Henry has competed all around the world, and he's actually an LXF and Deep MMA champion. He's won championships in multiple organizations, competed in Rizin over in Japan, and has been around the MMA scene for years. There's even a video on the MMA Fighting YouTube channel titled Portrait Victor Henry from around 6 years ago. So this man has been on the UFC's radar and on the MMA community's radar for a very long time. He's a very flow state type of fighter where he can exchange on the feet, switch his stances, use evasive and defensive footwork, and be very hard to hit, but also come back with combinations of his own. He is known for, however, for his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and can lock you up in a submission before you even know what's going on. So even though he's only had one fight in the UFC, La Mangosta is here to stay, and I cannot wait to see who they give him next in his UFC tenure. The next prospect on our list comes in the form of the cousin of the former lightweight champion Khabib Nurmagomedov, an undefeated bantamweight prospect, Umar Nurmagomedov. Now, Umar has only had 2 fights under the UFC banner, but both of them were victories, and both of them were victories via submission. The same submission, actually, in a rear naked choke. The first victory came over Sergey Morozov, and the second one most recently over Brian Boom Boom Kelleher. Kelleher is a fighter who has been in the UFC for a very long time, and although he's kind of been on and off with his performances throughout his career, he is a very tough test to get in one of your first fights in the division. And to get a finish and get it as easily as he did, he was able to get to the back, sink his hooks in, and lock up that rear naked choke just about as quick as you could say his entire name. Umar is a very, very promising contender, and you can't only go off of his last name, because I feel like he has a lot of potential to live up to, so you have to judge the fighter for who he is. But he was also a combat sambo world champion at the young age of only 19 years old. So just going off what we know so far, and even though there are a lot of questions in terms of Umar's future and his potential in this 135-pound division, I think he will have no problem strangling his way towards the top 15 and top 10 of the division over time. The next fighter on our list is Mini Masvidal, Adrian Yanez. Now, did you really expect this guy to not make the list? I mean, you did see the thumbnails, so, you couldn't have expected him not to be on here. But the only reason I feel like a lot of people call him Mini Masvidal, and you've heard commentators in the UFC call him this as well, is because he's very reminiscent of an early professional career Jorge Masvidal, even early UFC career Jorge Masvidal, with the short black hair and the goatee. But you have to look at Adrian Yanez for his overall performances, and coming off of the Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series, this guy has some of the quickest hands in the 135-pound bantamweight division. But it's not just his speed, it's not just his ability to change up the tempo with his boxing combinations and the fact that he has knockout power. It's the fact that he has crisp and clean counters and some of the best timing when it comes to countering opponent shots and finding openings in the UFC. Now, he hasn't fought the best of the best yet, but he most recently competed against Davy Grant. And Davy Grant just went to war with Marlon Chito Vera in his last fight. And Marlon Vera is about to go up against the number 4 ranked fighter in the division, or number 5 ranked fighter in the division, somewhere around there, in the New England Cartel's Rob Font. Now, I'm a big fan of Font, and I think that Chito Vera versus Rob Font is a phenomenal fight. But the fact that Adrian Yanez fought Davy Grant and Marlon Chito Vera went to war with Davy Grant shows me a lot in terms of where Yanez is going to be going later on in his career into 2022 and into 2023. By the end of the year, I could see him ranked as the number 12 or 13 fighter in the division, potentially cracking the top 10. I don't want to jump the gun too fast, but from what I've seen so far, his speed is a different level. His ability to find counter shots is a different level, and he has some of the best boxing in the UFC. But as we said, it's not really about the boxing, it's more about the timing. And it's only a matter of time before it's the time of Adrian Yanez. Rounding off our list, we have the youngest fighter in the UFC roster at 21 years of age in Mokaev. Now, Mokaev fights out of Manchester, England, and only has a professional record of 7 victories and no defeats. He's only competed once under the UFC banner, and that came in the form of Cody Durden. He was able to make quick work of Durden, however, after landing a beautiful left flying knee and locking up a guillotine, quickly switching it to a figure 4 front choke, if that's what you'd like to call it, and getting the first round submission. Now, you sit here and say, well, he's 21 years of age, he's only had 7 professional fights, 8 professional fights, including the one no contest on his record. How is he considered one of the best prospects in the world? Well, if you go back and look at his amateur record, he had an amateur record of 23 victories and no defeats by the time he was 20 years old. So even though he's new to the professional mixed martial arts game and definitely new to the UFC, Muhammad Mokaev has almost 30 fights to his name and hasn't lost a fight in his career yet. Now, it's early on and you never know. Things can change very quickly when it comes to these young up-and-coming rising stars. But I think Muhammad Mokaev has future champion written all over him. Over 30 mixed martial arts fights by the time you're 21 years of age. The youngest fighter on the UFC roster, in my opinion, is destined to be a champion in the coming years. He brings a much-needed jolt to the UFC's 125-pound flyweight division, and I believe Mokaev will punish his way through the rankings and get to that title quicker than we think. The final fighter on our list comes in the form of undefeated Georgian featherweight at 12 victories and no defeats in Ilia Topuria. Topuria had his last fight up against Jai Herbert, who was a much taller, longer, and rangier fighter with some very, very technical and crisp striking that he's been able to showcase in his very short UFC career as of late. Jai Herbert was able to catch Topuria with a lead left high kick, but Topuria was able to survive it and then eventually work on the inside and use some of the beautiful body work that he's showcased. Most notably, the left hook to the body or the liver shot if we're talking to Bas Rutten, and then coming over the top with a nasty overhand right and putting Jai Herbert completely out cold. He put him on autopilot with one shot, and it showcases that not only is Topuria a very, very highly touted prospect, not only is he an undefeated fighter in the UFC, not only is he only 25 years of age, but this man has knockout power, the technical ability, and the fight IQ to take himself very far in the UFC. I think the best showcase of his fight IQ was that fight against Ryan Hall back at UFC 264. He was able to avoid the ground game at all costs and eventually tie him up and knock him out with brutal ground and pound after Hall, the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and one of the most creative Jiu-Jitsu artists in the world, tied himself up in a vulnerable position and got caught with bombs from Topuria from the top. It seems that Topuria and fan favorite UFC lightweight Paddy the Baddy Pimblett have a little bit of bad blood after a brief confrontation prior to the last fight night which they competed on. It looks as if these men could be matched up next at 155 pounds. And I know Topuria is a featherweight, I know he would be at a reach and height disadvantage, but with his ability to get on the inside and use that beautiful footwork to set up those nasty body shots and then open up the head for power shots for days, I think Topuria would have a signature performance against Paddy the Baddy Pimblett. And I know people are probably going to come at me for not saying that Paddy the Baddy Pimblett is going to be a champion, but honestly, Paddy Pimblett hasn't impressed me much at all, except for the fact that he was able to eat that monstrous left hook from Luigi Vendramini and then come back to finish him off. But Topuria is another story, and that's why he rounds off our list for the top 10 prospects in the UFC.